Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us in our 2024 complimentary webinar series covering the FAR, or Federal Acquisition Regulations. We're coming from you live today from Washington, D.C., and we're glad you're all here. A bit about this series. As usual, all of our webinars are complimentary and recorded. The FAR has 52 total parts, and we will run through them sequentially each week on Wednesdays and Fridays at noon at Eastern Time. The recordings and PowerPoints will be posted within 24 hours of the webinar's ending. You can find the recordings on our YouTube channel simply by subscribing to it using the link you see on the screen. There is no cost. You can find the PowerPoint on the SlideShare site using your LinkedIn credentials to log in. Again, no cost for that either. And we also offer sponsorship opportunities, and if you're interested, please send us an email at hello@jenniferschaus.com. To sign up for the series, unfortunately, there's no bulk registration, so you must register individually for each webinar. If you go to the Jennifer Schaus website, navigate to the section called the FAR, you'll find the individual registration links. Also, the recording links will be posted here upon the completion of each webinar. Please note that we covered the FAR in 2020, so if you're eager to get a jump start, please find these historical recordings on our site. Navigate to the Webinars tab and scroll down to the section, the FAR 2020. Because it has been 4 years, many of the regulations have changed and been updated, so please use this as a reference tool only. And now a bit about us. We work with established federal contractors worldwide, helping them to navigate the market. Our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles and compliance. Some of the contract vehicles we support are listed here on your screen. For more information, please visit our website. Those are our services for federal contractors, but we also provide marketing and advertising services for organizations who are selling to federal contractors. We can add extra muscle to your marketing efforts via our newsletter ads and webinar sponsorship to in-person events. Please email us and ask for a media kit if you're interested. We are currently offering a buy one, get one special in our newsletter, which reaches over 30,000 subscribers. If you want to place an order or have any questions, please send us an email at hello@jenniferschaus.com. Contract vehicles can be great marketing tools for pursuing federal business. Current open solicitations include Navy Seaport, Next Generation, and NASA, as well as GSA Alliant. Additionally, the GSA Multiple Award Schedule is an open and rolling RFP. If you qualify for any of these and need proposal support, please send us an email for a quote. As you know, congressional hearings on both the House of Representatives and on the Senate side are open to the public, unless otherwise stated. We have a list here of the upcoming schedules, including the date, time, building, and room numbers. Most meetings take place in the Dirksen, Rayburn, or Cannon buildings. If you are selling to any of these departments or agencies, attending the hearings can be a great way to gather information, understand the process, and also network with influencers. Please join us for these upcoming complimentary webinars with various Apex accelerators. Jennifer will be teaching in this federal marketing webinar for the Michigan Apex Accelerator. The registration link is in our newsletter, or you can email us to get the link. Additionally, Jennifer will cover GSA schedules as well as federal marketing for our local Apex Accelerator in Virginia. These are complimentary and online webinars, so please join us. Jennifer will also be teaching 2 classes for the Maryland Apex Accelerator, one on marketing and one on the GSA schedules. These are in July and in December, and once again, they are complimentary. Now coming up in June, we'll hear from Carrie Palmatier on small business innovation and federal contracting. Specifically, Carrie will cover information on SBIRs and STTRs. These 2 options are a great way for tech companies to grow in the federal sector. This is a 2-part series. As always, these are recorded and complimentary. Please join us and over 300 government contractors on Monday, June 24th at the Kennedy Center for our Federal Government Contractor Summer Soiree. Firstly, we want to thank our event partner BidSpeed and also our sponsors, Capital Bank, RXO, GovSpend, and Federal Compass. You can also meet with the federal government, including the SBA, USAID, and NAVAIR. Additionally, we want to thank our in-kind sponsor, the Virginia Apex Accelerator. Please register in advance to attend or consider sponsoring. Ticket prices will increase on Friday, June 7th. Our webinars are complimentary thanks to our longtime and generous corporate and in-kind sponsors. Please allow me to introduce them. We would like to thank our friends at GovEvents, the premier platform for posting events related to government and government contracting. You can find all of our webinars and our events on govevents.com, as well as recordings from our past 600 plus webinars. We also want to thank Tom Johnson and his team at Set Aside Alert, the go-to publication for contracting opportunities for small, women-owned, veteran-owned, HubZone, and 8A firms. Visit setasidealert.com for more information. The Fairfax Economic Development Authority has an online calendar of events and webinars. We want to thank them for posting our events and webinars on their calendar. The Virginia Apex Accelerator at George Mason University offers free one-on-one counseling to established government contracting firms in Virginia on federal, state, and local procurement topics. If you're interested in learning more, please use the links provided to explore their services, review homework recommendations, register for live training, and find useful links to agencies and other self-directed learning. One-on-one counseling is limited to eligible client companies. Appointment requests are handled in the order they were received and based on counselor availability due to high demand. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on business location. Join the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce's monthly GovCon Council meeting to network with peers, learn about upcoming events and opportunities, and help to shape future programming. The meetings take place the fourth Tuesday of each month at 8:30 a.m. at the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce. The next meeting will be on June 25th. Do you want help winning government contracts? Bitsby can help. Users can find contract opportunities from federal, state, and local government. Additionally, you can search for teaming partners, incumbent point of contact, expiring contracts, compliance matrices, and also proposal templates. Create your login today at bitsby.com. Bitsby is an official partner of the U.S. Small Business Administration's E2G Empower to Grow program. Events are the ultimate engagement channel to bring government and industry together. 68% of government personnel report that they attend more than one event each year. The Federal Business Council, or FBC, has worked with government and industry for 45 plus years to create gatherings where ideas are shared and to help government achieve its goals. This includes agency industry days, cybersecurity symposiums, technology expos, and offsite meetings. FBC provides full lifecycle meeting planning and event management. With over 5,000 meetings under their belt, FBC has the experience, systems, and personnel to make your next event exceptional. Learn more at www.fbcinc.com. Now, last but not least, please check out our friends over at GovBrew. GovBrew is the most read GovCon newsletter, keeping thousands of GovCon professionals in the loop with news, updates, and opportunities in the federal contracting market, all in a fun and accessible email that only takes 5 minutes to read. It's 100% free to join. It goes out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 a.m. It's filled with great content, event postings, webinars, and more. We encourage you to sign up at govbrew.co, or you can use the QR code you see on the screen. And the reason we're here today is to cover FAR Part 36, Construction and Architecture Engineering Contracts. Now let's meet today's speaker. Please welcome Ed Delisle to the webinar. We are so glad to have you with us, Ed, and we're so excited to hear your presentation. I'll put myself on mute and turn the floor over to you.
Okay, great. Emma, thank you very much. I appreciate being here this afternoon with all of you. I'm Ed Delisle. I'm a partner at Thompson Hine, as you see here. I'm in the Government Contracts Practice Group at Thompson Hine. I'm also a member of the Construction Group at Thompson Hine. I've been in the government construction contracting business, if you will, for about the last 28 years or so. Most of my practice is comprised of both construction and government contracting work. And what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about FAR Part 36, which is construction and architect engineer contracts. Okay, Emma, if you could forward the slide. All right, so a little agenda for us today. So construction, architect, engineer services are jointly covered by FAR Part 36. It's interesting because you have an entire section of the FAR Part 36, which covers both construction and the procurement of architectural and engineering services. For the procurement of just architectural and engineering services, that's covered by FAR 36, FAR Part 36.6, and we'll specifically speak to that. For the procurement of construction services, that's covered specifically under 36.2, and we'll go through the requirements associated with that particular part of FAR Part 36, and we'll also cover 36.3, which is the joint procurement of both construction and architectural engineering services as one particular purchase by the government. And we'll also talk about some key contract clauses. Because I operate in the area of both construction and government contracting on a frequent basis, I see particular clauses an awful lot, and so I'll just touch on some of those because they directly relate in some way, shape, or form to FAR Part 36. Okay, Emma, if you could advance the slide. Okay, so as I just stated, FAR Part 36 discusses both the policies and procedures that are pertinent to the government's purchase of both construction and architectural engineering services. The preferred method for the government to obtain these services is through a two-phase selection process. And when we're talking about that specific process, we're talking about design build services, which is distinct and different from design bid build services. And we're going to talk a little bit about both as we progress through our discussion today. The services are often purchased separately. The traditional manner in which the government has purchased architectural engineering and construction services is separate. Okay, so they'll procure architectural engineering services. They'll have an idea as to, depending upon the agency, what they would like to have built, and they would procure the architectural engineering design aspect of that first, finalize it, and then put that set of plans and specifications out to bid by a construction contractors in a separate award or as part of a separate award, and that's the traditional method by which the government purchases those services. But that process has gradually changed over the years, and we'll talk about that just a little bit. And certainly as it relates to major purchases of architectural engineering and construction services, the two-phase selection process, which we're going to talk about first, is the dominant method of procurement. Okay, if we could advance the slide. All right, so how does the two-phase selection process work? Well, it works through how it's characterized in FAR subpart 36.3, which was added to the FAR in the 1990s to accommodate the combination of both architectural engineering and construction work and the purchase of both at the same time. The government, under a FAR 36.3 two-phase selection process, will develop a scope of work, an SOW, and oftentimes a BOD or a basis of design, and it will use that scope of work and basis of design for purposes of selecting a contractor or a team of contractors that can deliver both the design and the construction work through one particular procurement. In phase one of a 36.3 procurement process, the government will initially go through a technical analysis, as you see indicated here. And the idea is through phase one, what contractor, what team is technically most appropriate and qualified for purposes of delivering what the government wants. And as part of the phase one aspect of a 36.3 two-phase selection process, qualifications is the key. And as we'll see as we get into our discussion a little bit further, this mirrors the selection of just architectural engineering services. So it's a qualifications-based selection process. And as part of soliciting the contracting community under 36.3 for both architectural engineering and construction services, simultaneously, the qualifications through the phase one review process become the predominant issue. There is a down select process that is part of a two-phased selection under FAR subpart 36.3, and in the solicitation, the government agency will tell you approximately how many firms will get down selected for purposes of advancing from phase one to phase two. But as you see here, as part of the down select process and eliminating eliminating some of those who might otherwise be interested in performing and submitting as part of phase two, there are various different aspects of a team that the government will be interested in addition to just simply the technical approach and qualifications, but as more specific sub-factors of that, the specialized experience that the contractor or team may have in designing, performing, delivering projects of the type that the government is interested in become pertinent and important as part of phase one consideration. The capability to perform, sometimes that can include availability, time periods, how busy are you, when does the government wish to begin performance, what's its timeline for delivery, and past performance of the team can become a very important aspect of the phase one consideration. So, you know, has the team successfully performed and delivered for the government previously on projects of similar size and magnitude? That's the sort of thing that the government would be interested in as part of phase one. And as part of phase one, they may down select from whatever the initial number of interested contractors may be or contracting teams may be, 10, 15, maybe as many as 20. That would be an awful lot, particularly if it's a major project. But then they might down select to something in the range of 3 to 5. And those that advance from phase one to phase two would then go through a more traditional contracting by negotiation process, which is FAR Part 15, contracting by negotiation. And you would have things like past performance, experience, key personnel, management approach, schedule can sometimes be a consideration as part of a phase two selection process. And it's all done, you know, through a FAR Part 15 contracting by negotiation methodology. And as part of that review, price becomes important. And it only becomes important as part of phase two, not part of phase one. And if the process that we're going through here happens to be geared toward small businesses and set aside for small disadvantaged businesses, the fact that price is being offered as part of phase two becomes important from a size status perspective, to the extent that there might be a challenge to a contractor's size. So size would be determined at the point in time when the price is provided by the prospective contractor to the government in connection with its interest in performing this particular contract for whatever agency it may be that's putting the project or the contract out for bid. Okay, so this is all part of 36.3. Most of the major work that's performed anymore by the federal government uses this sort of process. The government began to shift in the 90s from using a straight design bid build process, which is still used and it's still common, but it started to shift more towards a design build process as opposed to design bid build for various different reasons, not the least of which is the pace with which it has the ability to move forward and to complete a project. It's faster typically to go through a process under 36.3 where you have design build versus design bid build, which is good for the government, and the risk for the government is it's a better deal for the government from a risk perspective. And that's because both the design and the construction performance is on the contractor. And as we'll talk about a little bit as we get into the presentation, where the construction itself is being performed on a design bid build, if it's being performed in that matter, the risk is more on the government, specifically as it pertains to design, because if the design is faulty in some way, shape, or form, and there's a problem on the construction end, which is where a lot of the cost can come from if you're the government, that can become problematic and would be the government's responsibility. In a 36.3 delivery methodology, the risk is more on the contractor than the government. So it's faster, and from a risk perspective, it's better for the government if it's done this way. And so for the vast majority of major projects anymore, you're seeing those done through FAR subpart 36.3. Okay, Emma, if you could advance the slide. All right, so let's switch gears a little bit and let's just talk about architectural and engineering services. So FAR 36 covers just simply the delivery of architectural and engineering services, and that was implemented through the Brooks Act. So FAR Part 36, specifically as it relates to the delivery of architectural and engineering services, which was implemented through FAR Part 36.6 back in and around 1972 through the Brooks Act. Was the Brooks Act was the formal introduction of a qualifications-based selection process, which it's interesting. Through the Brooks Act, you had, and it's typical that you'll have a statute that that's introduced. Congress introduces a statute that then needs to be implemented through the regulatory process, and it can take many shapes and forms once it leaves Congress. The Brooks Act was a little bit different in that the Brooks Act was essentially taken word for word and placed within FAR 36.6. It's a qualifications-based selection process. It's been around since before 1972. The Brooks Act is what codified it, but prior to that, this qualifications-based selection process had been around for quite a long period of time. Before the Brooks Act, you had construction projects which included the White House, the Capitol Building, Washington Monument, and even structures that go back beyond that into the Revolutionary War period that were all built using a design where qualifications-based selection took place, and it makes sense. And again, going all the way back to pre-Brooks Act periods of time, when it comes to structures and the importance of safety and aesthetic issues that were important as part of the construction process, having a qualifications-based selection process was deemed important as opposed to just price, which is oftentimes characterized as a race to the bottom, where price is being used as the most important factor. But qualifications-based selection was always deemed more important when it came to construction, again, for safety and aesthetic reasons. And it goes all the way back, as we say here, to pre-Civil War periods of time. And that philosophy of how architectural and engineering services should be selected carried over all those years later with the introduction of the Brooks Act. As implemented through FAR 36.6, it exists to this day. And again, the award process is entirely premised upon demonstrated competence and qualifications and the ability to perform and provide and deliver the architectural and engineering services that are pertinent to whatever it is that the government is interested in procuring under any given circumstance. And as I alluded to a few moments ago, price is not a factor, at least initially during the process of determining what company might be best qualified as part of being selected. Okay, Emma, if you could advance the slide. So in terms of how the procurement of just architectural and engineering services happens, you see it here. So there needs to be a public announcement of some kind, and typically that's going to be through the System of Award Management, SAM. There needs to be a competition of some kind. So as part of the public announcement, typically you have a statement of work that's identified through SAM, and sometimes you'll have a basis of design that's also a part of that. Typically it's a statement, more a statement of work. The competition is going to be premised upon that statement of work and the qualifications of those who are interested, which will be procured through an RFQ, request for qualifications process. And that request for qualifications will identify what the government is looking for in addition to the statement of work for purposes of being able to successfully deliver what it is that it wants. The contracting procedure that we're talking about is unique to the purchase of these services, and it's fully and completely contained within FAR 36.6. And the source selection authority, as you see here, is not permitted to use FAR 13, simplified acquisitions, FAR Part 14, which is sealed bidding, or FAR Part 15, negotiated procurements for purposes of performing the selection process as relates to just strictly architectural and engineering services. It needs to restrict itself to the requirements of FAR subpart 36.6. As it relates to mixed services, so if we're talking about design build as opposed to design bid build, which when we're talking about 36.6, we're talking more about design bid build, and this piece here, 36.6, being the design part of the design bid build process. But if we're talking about mixed services like design build, that's not considered, even though there's an architectural piece, an architectural engineering piece to it, obviously, but it's not considered to be a purchase of architectural engineering services. The combination of both AE and construction is handled by 36.3, which we just talked about, and it's not considered to be unique from a design perspective and does not fall within the parameters of 36.6. It's handled more like construction, the NAICS code that's used in a situation like that where you have mixed services where the government's buying both construction, architectural engineering. The NAICS code that would be assigned to that would be in the 236 family. So typically like 236220, which is the NAICS code that's used for general or industrial construction. And that's because it needs to be characterized consistent with what the government is primarily purchasing, and from a dollar perspective, that's always going to be the construction side. It's going to be vastly more expensive than the design side. Not that it's necessarily more or less important, but from a dollars and cents perspective, it's going to be much more expensive. And so that's how the NAICS codes are assigned when you're talking about design build versus design bid build. All right, if we could advance the slide. Okay, so staying with the Brooks Act and FAR subpart 36.6, the selection criteria process, again, it's identified in 36.6, and you'll see what the government must take into consideration as part of the selection process. The professional qualifications based upon the statement of work is the first and most important factor, and it's going to vary from project to project, obviously, but some examples of what might potentially become important as part of the qualifications process. If energy conservation, for example, is something that's important in a particular architectural or engineering project that the government desires, then that's obviously going to be something that's important as part of the process. Pollution prevention, waste reduction, again, it depends on the type of project that the government is interested in procuring, and the qualifications-based review is going to focus on whatever that statement of work may be. The capacity to perform, so how busy are you as an architectural engineering design company if you're vying for a project from the government that is simply premised upon architectural and engineering work? Do you have the time based upon when the government wishes to complete its design to actually perform? Geographic proximity, how far are you from the project itself, to the extent that that's important? Knowledge of the locality of the project. Have you done work in that locality as an architect or an engineer before? Are you familiar with the vicinity of the project? The soil conditions could potentially be important, and taking that into consideration as part of the design. Other buildings, if it's an urban design, and proximity of if it's a vertical construction project, of the vertical construction project that the government is anticipating will be designed for it, in relation to other buildings that are in and around the area. That will become important as part of the review process here. And other appropriate evaluation criteria, again, based upon the statement of work that the government issues for purposes of the selection process. There could be a design competition. What we're talking about here is not a full design. We're talking about conceptual design, consistent, again, with the statement of work or BOD basis of design that's been issued as part of the RFQ process. Okay, if we can advance the slide. So again, staying with the architectural engineering selection process, evaluation boards are used by agencies for purposes of determining who might be most qualified in connection with the statement of work that the agency issues. The boards can be permanent or ad hoc. Anymore, I don't know that agencies use permanent an awful lot. I'm more accustomed to seeing ad hoc as it pertains to the use of boards, and there should be experience. The idea is that there is experience contained on the boards that are established in the areas of architectural and engineering work, so that the most qualified contractors who are interested in performing that work are selected as part of the down select process that the government uses in this regard. Sometimes private practitioners are used as part of the evaluation boards, And to the extent that private practitioners are on those boards, they're not then eligible to perform the services thereafter. You have conflicts of interest that arise, and it's specifically forbidden that anyone who serves on an evaluation board can then be a part of the design process under FAR 36.6. And you run into similar issues where you have someone who's hired by the government to develop the statement of work, for example, or a BOD basis of design for the government that's used for purposes of procuring architectural engineering services. You can run into an issue there from a conflicts of interest perspective, and the government will attempt to avoid having a private practitioner who's involved in one process from also being involved in the subsequent process. And that's primarily from a competition perspective. I actually do have a situation right now that I'm dealing with where I had someone in a who was involved in the design piece, who was also going to be involved as a subcontractor on the construction piece. The difference there, and we're trying to work through it, but the difference there is that this was a sole source opportunity and not a competitive opportunity. And the government and the contractor, and I'm involved in this, we're working through that. We have a new contracting group that had never dealt with a situation on a sole source basis previously, and we're working through what they feel could be potential COI uses, but I don't, because it's a sole source and not a competitive situation, I don't see that as being problematic or an issue of any kind. But it can come up, and from time to time, that issue needs to be dealt with, but it's specifically, at least as it relates to architectural and engineering services, dealt with and discussed as part of FAR 36.6. Okay, if we could advance the slide. All right, so as far as how, before we transition to construction, as far as how the how evaluation boards handle the AE selection process, what will happen is there are standard form SF 330s. Government loves standard forms, and SF 330s are used by the government to collect information about architectural engineering companies, and those are kept by agencies, and sometimes they are refined and used specific for particular projects that are put out under RFQs. And so those SF 330s will be used by selection boards along with responses to RFQs. And there'll be that information will be used in conjunction sometimes with conceptual designs, sometimes interviews, and that process will be used to pare down a larger group to something that's more manageable. Usually they'll pare it down to 3 firms, and they'll put those firms in order 1, 2, 3, and the agency will then negotiate directly with firm number 1 for purposes of potentially entering into a contract with that architectural engineering firm to perform the services that it's seeking. And if that process is not successful, it will then go to 2 and then to 3. That's how that process works. Again, that's just under 36.6. And now let's shift gears to construction services. So we talked about how the government buys it collectively, design, construction. We talked about under the Brooks Act in 36.6, how the government will buy architectural engineering services by itself. And now let's talk a little bit more about buying construction services. So it's a little bit different than the process that we just talked about as it relates to architectural engineering. Unlike architectural engineering services and the selection process that pertains to it that is fully contained within FAR subpart 36.6, for construction services, it's primarily found in 36.2, And you will also see references to other parts of the FAR within 36.2 as relates to the procurement of construction services. Directly in 36.2, you'll see a reference to subpart 6.401A, and FAR Part 6 generally pertains to competition, and 6.4 generally stands for the proposition that the government wants to obtain its construction services on a competitive basis. That's not always the case. There are sole source opportunities that occur in terms of the government buying construction services, which is no different than lots of other things that the government buys. It can do so under the correct circumstances on a sole source basis, but generally you're going to have competition, and that competition can take different forms depending upon the size. It could be, I don't mention it here, but it could be under FAR Part 13, Simplified Acquisitions, FAR Part 14, which is sealed bidding, or FAR Part 15, negotiated procurements. So there are various different ways that the government can buy construction services, and doing it in a competitive environment is, generally speaking, how it's going to take place. No different than most things. All right, if we could advance the slide. So under FAR 36.2, there are some things about the purchase of construction services that are different and unique. And hence you have this entire section of the FAR that's devoted to both architectural engineering or design work and the actual construction that follows. And you see some of that here. So generally speaking, the government is required to generate a government estimate, an IGE, independent government estimate, which is supposed to be a very detailed takeoff of the work that's to be performed, so that the government has an understanding as to what it's going to cost. And construction services can be very expensive. So this IGE, the whole point of it is for the government, before it puts anything out to bid, to have an understanding as to exactly what it's going to cost. That cost estimate is then used for purposes of coming up with an order of magnitude, a disclosure of magnitude, which you see here. And that disclosure of magnitude is identified in the solicitation by a range. And you see examples of the ranges that you can find in a solicitation as part of this process that we're talking about. IGEs are generally not to be disclosed. In fact, it specifically indicates in FAR 36.2 that they're specifically not to be provided to the public. It's for the government's purpose. Occasionally, it becomes important in a litigation matter, and I litigate a lot of these cases, sometimes prime sub, sometimes it's prime government. And these IGEs, for those of you who ever get in a dispute with the government, occasionally you can get your hands on one in discovery, and it can become important. I had a case a few years ago where the IGE became super important. It was a project in Afghanistan. We built a lot of stuff in Afghanistan when the war was taking place, and there was a condition in Afghanistan, in the northeast part of the country, primarily where the mountains are. There is a condition called collapsible soil. You find it in other places too. Like I think you have in Idaho, it exists. And the thing with collapsible soil is that when you introduce water to it, the soil itself, it's like a sandy moon dust sort of material. It can collapse, very bad to build on. And on this one particular project that I had there, there was no geotechnical information provided by the government. What they indicated was that there was the possibility of finding this condition. When my client bid on the project, it bid on the project not taking that condition into consideration, just based on its own experience in terms of where the project was located and the conditions there compared to where collapsible soils, again, based upon its experience, were found previously. And so it bid it without needing to deal with that particular condition. As it turns out, the condition did exist, and it created delays and additional costs, et cetera. And so when we ended up litigating that issue later, we ended up getting our hands on the IGE, and the IGE was very clear that the government, as part of its IGE, did not anticipate that this condition would exist, and ultimately the dispute ended up resolving. But you know, the IGEs are obviously important for the specific purpose that I mentioned earlier. But if you ever run into an issue later, if you can get your hands on the IGE, it can be helpful in other ways too. This concept of statutory cost limitations, there are times where projects have cost limitations associated with them, and the government agency is not permitted to exceed those cost limitations as part of the procurement process. So that sometimes becomes an issue. Liquidated damages is something, obviously, for those of you that work within the government construction context, that is always something that you'll find in a government contract as it pertains to construction, and it's something you always have to keep in mind. Projects need to finish timely. Periods of performance can get extended, but if they're not extended, and even if they are, the liquidated damages will end up getting assessed to the contractor, either based on the original performance period, or if it's extended for those periods beyond the deadline of the extension for late delivery, and it can be steep. And based on FAR 11.502, it's going to be on a per day basis. It could be $500 a day per day that the project is delivered late. It could be $1,000, $5,000. It all depends on the particular type of project and where the project's located, the value of the project, et cetera. But liquidated damages are something that practitioners that operate in this area have to be aware of, and it's unique to construction. Okay, if we could advance the slide. FAR 36.2 sets forth that site inspections should be permitted. It also indicates that access to key data such as as-built information, which is particularly important for renovation type work, or boring logs, underground conditions, all of that should be provided if the government has it. If the government hasn't and does not provide it, there's an issue that the government can run into regarding superior knowledge. If you did know about it and you didn't tell me about it, you know, is it government is your fault for not telling me because you had the ability to warn me of certain conditions, you decided not to, et cetera. So that definitely can be an issue if there's a problem later and the government opts either not to allow you to view a site yourself if you're a prospective contractor, or does not provide information or the ability to obtain information based on a particular project that's being put out for bid by the government. So most of the time, particularly as it relates to site inspections, they're going to want contractors. The government will want contractors to participate in a site inspection, and we're going to talk a little bit about site inspections momentarily in a different context. But oftentimes, site inspections are mandatory for all the reasons that you would expect. The government, most of the time, wants to make sure that the contractor that's ultimately selected completely understands the area in which the project is going to be performed, if it's a renovation project, the condition of the building or buildings in which the contractor is going to operate, etc. FAR 36.2 also discusses the whole issue of assuring that the offeror understands the scope of work. So this is important as it pertains to obtaining prices that are significantly lower than what the independent government estimate indicates. It's sort of reminds you a little bit of a price realism sort of issue, which sometimes you can protest based on a price realism issue. Sometimes you can't, but is the price that's being provided by the contractor something that can actually be performed? I mean, the last thing that the government wants is for the contractor to have missed something, and now they're in a situation where they probably have to default the contractor, go back to the drawing board, find somebody else to do it, and it takes that much longer for delivery of the project, which is not good for anybody. So there's a provision of FAR subpart 36.2 which discusses this and indicates that the agency shall make sure in a situation like that that the contractor understands all aspects of the scope of work. Right, if we could advance the slide. Just I want to talk briefly about some ancillary aspects of construction that relate to FAR Part 36 in some way. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's important because it's peculiar to construction. Typically, if you're talking about an unrestricted procurement, there's going to be a self-performance requirement of some kind. If you're talking about a set-aside of some type for small business, that you really shouldn't have that because that's going to be covered by FAR Part 19 and by the SBA's regulations. But typically, you'll see something as you see here. And ordinarily, if something from FAR 52.236.1 is in your contract, if you're performing construction work, it's going to be something not less than 12%. So it's something to be aware of. If you're performing construction work for the government, there'll be some sort of self-performance requirement in there if it's in unrestricted procurement. If we can advance the slide. You could spend a whole hour or two on what we're seeing here on differing site conditions. Very important as it relates to construction related work. If the government provides specific indications of what you're to expect and what you find is materially different than that, you could have a type 1 differing site condition. If you have some sort of unknown physical condition that's of an unusual nature, you could have a type 2 differing site condition. Super important concepts to understand if you perform work for the federal government. I talked about site investigations a few moments ago. If 52.236.3 is in your contract and you're selected to perform for the government, you can be guaranteed pretty much that it's going to be in there, that you're going to have to make sure you do your due diligence. You need to make sure that you understand whatever the logistical restraints may be. If you're in an area where weather is an issue, you better understand that, particularly if you're going to be building, for example, vertical construction during periods of rainy conditions, or if there are winter conditions and the period of performance goes through winter time period, you have to make sure that you account for that. Equipment that might be needed based upon whatever the statement of work might be. All of these things you have to have a complete understanding of prior to agreeing to perform for the government, and make sure that you do what's reasonably necessary to, in fact, understand what the requirements are before entering into that contract. If you could advance the slide, Emma. Superintendents, again, this is peculiar to construction. Not really, I mean, typically not something that you fight with the government about. You have to either directly superintend or assign someone to superintend if you're a contractor performing construction work for the government. Somebody has to be on site with the authority to work or to act rather on behalf of the contractor. Pretty straightforward. I did run into an issue about a year and a half ago where the government was not very happy that the assignment and authority to act had been delegated to a major subcontractor. The project was primarily an HVAC type project, and so we delegated to the HVAC subcontractor. We had to work with the government to deal with that because they didn't like it, because there was no direct contractual tie that the sub had to the government, and we had to work through that issue. Also under superintendents, you get into this whole issue from time to time as to how long the superintendence has to take place. I mean, it seems kind of obvious. All times during performance and until the work is completed. Sounds very straightforward. Well, if it's a design build project under 36.3, which we talked about a few moments ago, the performance really starts during the design phase. I've had issues where the government has said, okay, well, yeah, I know, but we want someone to be on site for the entirety of the project, and because the contract says that we can require that, then you have to do it. Well, I mean, it seems a little silly if we're going through the design phase and the government's requiring that you have a presence on site, but I've had to deal with that before. And then sometimes on the back end, you can run into issues if the government adds requirements to the end of a project, and they include the procurement of long lead items. Does it make sense to have a superintendent there for months while you're waiting for that long lead item to get to the project site so it can be installed when there's nothing else to do? Well, if the government wants to pay for that, that's fine, but oftentimes the government doesn't, and so every once in a while you'll get into an argument with contracting personnel from the government over issues like that. If you could advance the slide. Schedules are, again, peculiar to construction. Not going to spend really much time on it other than to make you aware of it here. Sometimes the requirements for construction schedules are simple, and you can see a quote that I've taken from 52-236-15 here. A simple progress chart is sometimes good enough, but sometimes you can have much more stringent requirements, particularly if it's a major project, and if there is a change in the schedule, or if there is an impact to the schedule, sometimes the contract can be very specific in terms of how that impact to the schedule is handled. So I just pointed out to folks that are on that are listening to the webinar to pay attention to what your specific contract says as it pertains to schedules if you're performing construction work for the government. And if you don't maintain your progress consistent with the schedule, consistent with the POP or period of performance, of course you can run into default and termination issues. We can advance the slide. Specs and drawings as it relates to FAR 36.2. Okay, so if it's design, bid, build, project, this becomes super important. specs and drawings, you have to read them collectively. The specifications are going to be more important than the drawings. Oftentimes they're more detailed, and you're going to be held to whatever the requirements are in the specifications. If there's something in the design, whether it's the specifications, drawings, or something in between, that's created either the need for additional work because either something's missing or there's something that creates the need for a change, okay, because it's not clear what the specs and drawings are requiring. Under the Spearin doctrine, if it's design bid build situation, then the contractor that's performing won't be held responsible for that. It'll be the government that's held responsible for that. And so Spearin doctrine is something to just sort of understand generally when you're talking about design bid build. It can come up in design build situations, but it's not nearly as prevalent as design bid build situations. So just understanding generally Spearin, you can spend a whole lot of time on the Spearin doctrine, but that's for another day. But it's just something to be to understand if you're going to be performing construction work for the government. Next slide. Of course, the general, this is more general, and I'll just talk about this very, very briefly, but your changes clause, being aware of what changes clause is in your contract, whether you're talking about architectural engineering or construction, understanding what the changes clause in your contract is important, and understanding that changes can be constructive. The George Bernard Shaw quote that you see here, the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place, is something I started using during COVID. During COVID, everyone seemed to think, contractors that is, seemed to think, well, everyone understands, the contracting community understands it, contracting officers and cores and COTARs, et cetera, they all understand that, oh, it's COVID, then there are going to be impacts, et cetera. Well, no, appropriate communication is important. If you run into a change, most of the time, especially when I get involved, it's constructive in nature. It's not necessarily dictated by modification, although that often happens too. But a lot of times when I become involved, it's constructive in nature, and providing notice to the contracting personnel that you have a problem is the most important thing. It can be really difficult on the contractor if that appropriate communication and written notice is not provided. Okay, if we could advance a slide. Similar to what we just talked about, more general, but important to understand, suspensions of work, particularly when they're constructive. If you run into an issue or a problem, particularly on a construction project, there are important notice provisions in particular that you need to pay attention to, particularly as it relates to your ability to collect costs that might be associated with construction suspensions of work. So something to keep in mind, and a little bit different, peculiar, more important, in my opinion, as it relates to construction work than suspensions of work that might pertain to other industries within the government context. If we could advance a slide. And same thing as it relates to stop work. Stop work is important as from a construction perspective. Obviously, stop work orders are going to impact the ability for you to advance a project, whether it's construction or not. But in the construction context, from a scheduling perspective and from a liquidated damages perspective, making sure that the requirements of the stop work order are followed are obviously important, and that notice is provided to the contracting authorities as to how you're being impacted, and the cost of it is important. If we can advance the slide. Excusable delay is also very important in the construction context, in particular as it relates to liquidated damages. For delays associated with things of the sort that you're seeing here will get you time, won't get you money, but it'll get you time. And it's important from a scheduling perspective and liquidated damages to understand when it is that you might be entitled to excusable delay to prevent things like default and termination. Advance the slide. Okay, so that's my little take on FAR Part 36 and the contractual provisions within the FAR that pertain to it. If anybody has any questions, there's my information. Please feel free to reach out.
Thank you again, Ed, for your presentation, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. As mentioned, you can always catch the recording on our YouTube channel within 24 hours and find over 600 webinars on government contracting there. And that's it for today's webinar. Thank you again, Ed, and everyone who joined us, and we hope to see you on Friday for Part 37.